speaker of the session, Steve Jackson, and this is again a honored paper, a honorable mention, an excellent paper, also deals with cyber infrastructures, empirical work on it, and Steve has a specific perspective on the role of standards. Please.
All right, let me get this rolling here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a program of work. It's actually a long-term program of work, but I'm going to tell you about a particular aspect of it today. So the work I'll be talking about today emerges from a particular interest in the role of standards in large-scale collaborative projects, and in particular the development of infrastructure around large-scale projects. And it's, in some sense, it's a story directed at people who think about cyber infrastructure in the way that we've just heard. But I also hope to use it a little bit to think as an occasion to reflect more broadly on how HCI approaches questions of standards, how it might begin to approach them somewhat differently. So the work paper poses 4 central questions. What work do in the American pragmatist sense? What work do standards do? Again, in brackets, in large-scale systems development in the sciences. How can standards struggle and fail? And what happens when they do? How do actors work across the holes and gaps that standards inevitably leave? And I'll explain the inevitable part as we go along, if it's not already obvious to you. And finally, a little bit more speculatively at the end, the question of what is the relationship between standards, innovation, and change? And again, if the immediate empirical frame are problems in American ecology and new computational development in that world, I'm also interested in a meta sense in how HCI researchers more broadly can learn from this kind of experience. So empirically, the paper looks at 2 different cases and scales of standards development in ecological work. The first case, which we're talking about as Northern Lab, this is in some sense a very classic kind of ecological research site. It's a traditional PI-led field team. And the second one is a much larger initiative that I'll talk a little bit more about as we go on, called the National Ecological Observatory Network, or NEON. And NEON is one of a growing class of projects that have the goal of transforming the American field sciences and other areas of work. Okay, theoretically and practically, the paper draws on 2 basic literatures. The first is the comparatively small and scattered body of HCI work that acknowledges, sometimes ruefully, sometimes in kind of parenthetical comments, the challenges to design posed by weak, non-existent, or inconsistent standards. So many domains of HCI work struggle with this. If you think about things like software development, home networking, sustainability, privacy, first responder systems, in the HCI work in any of these literatures, you can find instances where people struggle to overcome the problems of an incompletely standardized landscape. Other areas of HCI work depend on and sometimes take for granted the accomplishments of standards. So a nice example for those of you who are in the very nice session this morning on sustainable HCI, think about the way in which HCI design and analytic efforts in that world depend on standards in a second-order way produced elsewhere, standards of environmental measure, accountability, etc. So we can assign different theoretical languages to what standards do in such contexts. So we can think of these as coordination mechanisms or boundary objects if we want to bring in some classic terms from CSCW. In an immediate sense, this paper actually started in some ways with thinking that was prompted by a very nice piece by Keith Edwards et al. In the 2010 CHI called The Infrastructure Problem in HCI. A second source for our work is a growing body of HCI and social science work around collaboration and computational change in the sciences, also known as cyber infrastructure or e-science. We had a nice example of that in the previous talk. And here we draw particularly on traditions of work that have considered such problems from the standpoint of infrastructure. And I won't bore you with a technical definition, but broadly, forms of human and material support and scaffolding that are central to collaboration and interactive systems of all types. Within that world, we draw in particular on work that has been made the link explicitly from standards to infrastructure and back again. So a very nice edited volume by Martha Lamplin and Lee Starr called Standards and Their Stories. And in this world, the understanding of standards is as follows. So standards are nested inside one another. It's standards all the way down. When you encounter a standard, usually it rests on some other set of standards. Standards are distributed unevenly across the socio-technical landscape, again, as HCI research regularly and sometimes painfully encounters. Standards are relative to communities of practice. They're often, mastery of standards are often a measure of standing within communities of practice. They are linked and integrated through larger social and technical entities, so organizations, nations, systems. They embody or can enforce preference and values, so standards are often not innocent in this sense. Many of the values of systems, in fact, are built in at the level of standards, and they may be productive of inclusion and exclusion. So this language of orphans of infrastructure that comes out of infrastructure studies, naming this potential politics of standards. And again, for those of you who follow this work, you will see deep consonance between this definition of standards, understanding of standards, and broader theories of infrastructure that have been developed over many years in HCI and the social sciences. Beyond all this, and in particular for the purposes of today, I'd like to emphasize the notion of standards as mechanisms of order and efficiency. And when we think about the work they do in the world, that a big part of the work they do is producing this order and setting up the world in ways that, in fact, can be responded to through action and design. So in all these ways, standards and protocols maintain the practices and expectations of users and designers against the messy churn of the worlds around them. Standards shape the space available to system developers, ensuring that innovation meets the world in a workable fashion. This is a rich story of artifacts, tools, and the complexities associated with bringing features of the built world around us into better and more sustainable alignment through design. But it's also a story of everything that design touches: practices, organizations, values, and expectations, all of which may be implicated and shaped by the work of standards development. We design to, from, and with standards. And if there weren't standards, we'd have to design everything and be a lot smarter than we in fact are. Okay. So moving on to the cases. As I say, there are two main cases. The first one we're calling simply the lab at Northern Station. This is a long-term Northern research program that's attached to a major Midwestern university in the US. And Northern Lab is in many ways emblematic of the traditional scale and organization of ecological work in the US and indeed many other parts of the world. So it's PI-led. It's operated through a mix of technical staff, postdocs, PhD students, and undergrad summer researchers. The research team at Northern Lab is typically on the order of 6 to 10. It fluctuates a bit by season and certainly by time within the year. The key field season, active field season, is in the summer. The off season is dedicated to lab work and analysis. The PI at Northern Lab has been operating in this site for more than 20 years. And while the lab shares space and occasionally people with other research programs that are operating at Northern Station and coordinates loosely with similar researchers in other locations, it does have significant autonomy to sort of call its own shots. And I should, so just to give, if the pictures of field research start to seem too attractive for those of you who spend a lot of time at your computer, I should note that the picture on the left with all the snow is in June. And the little dots on the map there are all mosquitoes. So it's not quite as idyllic as it's sometimes cracked up to be. Okay, so a few quick notes on standards challenges as experienced in the lab. So a key problem here is questions of training and turnover. So like many summer research stations, the staff turns over very regularly and often seasonally. Field work at the lab is distributed work and needs to be carried out by a team of students and field techs, all operating independently, and most of whom are changing with some regularity. So questions of training and turnover are central to the problems of standards and ensuring that the consistency of work is maintained. There's a separate concern, partly related to that and partly separately, that's typically identified in the ecology world as protocol drift. And that's the point that even if you have a stable team of researchers, and even if you start by doing things the same, over the course of time and repeated practice, small changes can creep into the mundane operations in such a way that programs that kind of start in a consistent way diverge over time. And if what you're interested in is a long-term research program designed to do things like indicate emergent change at a global scale, this turns out to be a big problem. So the image here is an image of training, but it could just as easily be an image of retraining. So there's a lot of training, retraining, and so on that goes on in the lab. One of the most interesting features for us, so we've worked across a lot of different research sites in ecology now, and one of the most interesting features of this particular site is the absolute care and attention paid to the maintenance of the sanctity of the standards. And the centerpiece of that, in this case, is the protocol book, the lab protocol book, which at the time of the writing of the paper was 375 pages. I went and checked in just while setting up for the talk. It's now at 396 pages. And the protocol book plays a number of key roles in this world. It's used in training in the ways we've just talked about, including prior to the field season. So one of the ways the faint of heart research assistants are sorted out is they hand them the protocol book, and those who actually read it and come back have sort of already passed a certain kind of screening. It's deployed as a reminder or authority when methods are in dispute. It's meticulously updated with all revisions dated and signed, and it's intended and to some extent achieves, but only to some extent, a comprehensive formal description of everything the lab does. So everything from planning and prep to field execution to lab analytics, handling and transport of specimens, etc. The protocol book, as you might guess, with a document that's nearly 400 pages, is also too large and unwieldy to easily deploy. So to meet that problem, the lab has also developed a series of intermediate standard statements, which they call Wallocols, because they are written out in short form and posted on the wall around sites of ecological work. So if you look at the picture on the right, some of the things that are posted on the wall in front of her are essentially boiled down descriptions of the standards that are meant to govern the particular lab operations that she's performing. And so in this case, what we see is not only a standard, coming back to the nested point, but sort of a cascade or a continuum of standards that collectively govern the work and manage the work in this station. There are a number of things, additional things that make standards hard in this space. So one point is that the application of standards can never be fully described in a way that we'll talk about a little bit more in detail in the NEON case. The contingencies can never be fully exhausted. And important elements of touch and feel resist easy codification. So one of the interesting features of ecological fieldwork, like many forms of practice that involve tactile, physically based, kind of embodied interactions, is that there are just important things that are almost impossible to articulate in a text or on a page. So this is an example of a researcher explaining to us how you tell someone about the difference between rocks and permafrost. One of the things they study is permafrost, and over time this has important implications for things like climate change, for example. So, okay, so they go on, they say, you know, this is how you do it. This is what we say in the protocol, and you could read that all day and never know the difference between a rock and the ice. You wouldn't know that in the field unless you actually had a feel for it and someone was there telling you, and then he describes. Dink, hear that sound? Yeah, I haven't heard that before. Yeah, that's a rock. Now move it a little bit over and do it in the permafrost. That's the ice. Do you see the difference? Yes. Do you feel the difference? Yes. Done. Okay, so this is how standards are actually communicated on practice and in the ground, on the ground. There's also a need to periodically adjust or interpret standards in light of natural variations unanticipated in the protocol book. So this is an example. One of the things they study at the lab at Northern Station are stream discharges at inlets. Now it turns out that the mouth of an inlet is an extremely sort of hard to describe thing. So they have a series of measurements that are like sample at the 0 meter mark, the 2 meter mark, the 5 meter mark, the 10 meter mark. And this requires actually significant judgment for a couple of reasons. One is that depending on the inlet, you may find that the place you would sample is actually taken up by a rock, or the place you would naturally sample falls right behind a rock. Rivers don't flow in one, they don't even flow in one direction, it turns out. They flow at multiple speeds. There are eddies. Anyone who's a canoeist or a kayaker could tell you that. So actually exhibiting some discretionary judgment to ensure that the spirit of the standard is maintained, even when the letter needs to be relaxed, is important. So one of the concerns actually that the PI of Northern Station regularly talks about, even though he's a stickler on standards and he develops this 400-page protocol book, is his equally large concern with the negative impact of what he talks about as rote or dead standards. So if the impact of the standardization efforts are to, in effect, de-skill and remove the imagination and care and effort of the field workers, then in fact they can have a deeply negative consequence, because you can end up with people collecting things that don't serve the long-term needs of the science. Okay, switching gears, I'm now going to talk a little bit about the second case, which is the National Ecological Observatory Network. This is a $434 million 30-year project. That's the dominant project in U.S. ecology today. Construction began in 2011, will be completed in 2017. It's currently partly operational. So NEON's a complex project involving multiple kinds of work, each of which implicates standards in a different way. So here we can see towers, remote sensing, satellite, data products, cyber infrastructure, which they mean computational systems, systems engineering, and a biological field program. So in each case, standardization plays an enormous role. There's an important step of negotiating standards. This is the primary job of the NEON science staff today. They are, in effect, writing the standards that will guide NEON activity for the next 30 years. They face huge challenges in this work. One is the extreme heterogeneity of environments that NEON, as a continental scale entity, is required to address. There are also highly localized research traditions and interests, including in method and fit and continuity with existing data sets. And one of the interesting kind of sociological features of this case is that most of the NEON staff scientists are junior people. They're out of postdoc, effectively postdoc scale or out of postdoc scale, just out of the postdoc stage. And they're involved in extremely contentious disciplinary negotiations. So it's an extremely uncomfortable position for them to be in. Problems aren't limited to the writing of protocols. Some of the largest concerns are around articulating standards in a complete and indisputable way, and another one around enforcing standards against unwanted forms of change, for example, protocol drift, like we mentioned earlier. So one of the interesting things that they deploy is a cold testing procedure. Cold testing is something that ethnomethodologists or Wittgenstein would find extremely interesting in this context. They, in effect, hand the protocol cold to a group of untrained people and see if they can actually reproduce the procedure. And the answer in almost every case on the first go is no. So there's a lot of iteration back and forth before the protocol can actually be expressed at a level of detail that works. Final concern with NEON is the question of change and how to incorporate change over time. So while the core of NEON's value is the care and longevity of its data sets, there's also recognition of the need to adapt to the times. Otherwise, we reach the end of the project and you're effectively, it's 2037 and you're doing 2017 science. So to sum up very quickly, standards are everywhere and come in many varieties, some of them surprising. They're also hard and hard differentially, affecting different parts of complex interactive systems in different ways. These difficulties may increase with scale as practices move towards higher levels of aggregation. They also grow with heterogeneity as systems seek to bring increasingly diverse worlds, people, artifacts, and environments into alignment. But standards are also intimately connected to much of what HCI researchers seek to accomplish in the world. So I won't go into the takeaways very long, other than to note that building with, from, and to standards ought to be a central goal of HCI engagement in this space and many other spaces. When I say from, I'm indicating being thoughtful about the range of standards, both technical, organizational, and social, that actually structure and circumscribe the worlds we engage. Two, names and aspiration of the field. I mean, this partly connects probably to the first talk in this session. I think building a standard ought to be something that we assign a very high value in our list of objectives. We need to work artfully across type and scale, and we also need to be thoughtful about how we accommodate contingency, change, and growth, perhaps even improvisation and discovery. And I will leave you with a sort of a puzzle at the end of the paper, which hopefully will become the focus of a future paper, which is the question of whether we can gain anything around thinking about standards in science by comparison to the way we think about standards in jazz. So in the world of jazz, like the world of science, standards play a number of crucial roles. It's the basis of interoperability. It's the arbiters of quality. Standards as tunes are usually played, but they're also the thresholds competent performers must reach. They're markers of membership and distinction. And they're also one of the key platforms around which innovation in jazz proceeds. So when jazz performers are developing a new sound or a new approach, one of the dominant ways they do that is to reinterpret the standards, to play the standards differently. And you can see this happen across generations of performers in jazz. So in scientific collaboration, but also many other domains of HCI life, standards shape and constrain the worlds of design and practice that HCI researchers inherit and engage. They organize practice, producing forms of stability, routinization, and predictability around which subsequent design can build. They guide local action and expectation towards systemic or collective demands. And these features become additionally important as HCI enters into increasingly broad and multifarious engagements with the world around us, which is the space I think that HCI now occupies. And with that, and with apologies for running over, I will leave off.